Okay, and we are now live, so I'm going to give people time to arrive and come in. This is really exciting. And
exciting.
Yeah, you can probably see.
Yeah, I do. Wonderful.
And do you have your copy of the book with you?
I do.
I mean, there's a couple of, I wanted to, I think I'm going to invite you to read something that's really particularly meaningful to you. And then I had a part that I wanted to ask you to read.
Great.
If we have time. All right, so a couple more seconds here. We have a lot of people that will be joining us not live, but we'll have a nice group that are joining us live as well, including people that know and love you already.
Oh, that's sweet.
Yeah. All right, so good afternoon, good evening, and good morning to some of you. We always have a very transatlantic group with us here. I'm so excited to be with you, and especially to be with all of you with Seb together. Everyone, this is Sebene Selassie, and I'm going to read a little bio that I compiled based on what was on your website and what was available, and then you can add to it. So Sebene Selassie was born in Ethiopia and raised in white neighborhoods in Washington, D.C. She was a tomboy Black girl who loved Monty Python and UB40 and never believed she belonged, but she does belong. As a young person, she was drawn to explore the connections between creative life and community and contemplative practice. Sebene received a BA from McGill University, where she studied comparative religious studies and women's studies both. She has an MA in media studies from the New School, and there she focused on cultural studies and race. For over 20 years, Seb worked with children, youth, and families, both nationally in the US and internationally for small and large nonprofits. Her work has taken her everywhere from the Tenderloin in San Francisco to refugee camps in Guinea, West Africa. She believes in the power of arts-based learning and also has planned, coordinated, and taught a variety of creative programs, including intergenerational photography, digital storytelling, and youth media. Seb is also a 3-time breast cancer survivor, stages 3 and 4 included. She has learned that healing is more than just stopping a disease or a condition, and that healing is about learning to nurture ease and well-being within our bodies, hearts, and minds in every moment. She believes that some of the strongest medicine for ourselves and our communities is the self-care that we're often taught to neglect. Sebene has been studying Buddhism for 30 years. She teaches classes and retreats regularly across the US and is a meditation teacher on the 10% Happier app. She lives on the unceded territory of the Lenape in Brooklyn, New York, with her partner, Frederick. And it feels funny saying this for you, Seb. Her pronouns are she, her, and hers. I have personally had the incredible joy and honor of being in a mentoring relationship with Seb. And just to be clear, Seb is doing the mentoring. And I think of this relationship as one of my many aspects of clinical supervision that I talk about a lot, how important it is for those of us that are teaching or doing healing work or are in front of communities to be receiving regularly. And I have also sat retreat with Seb. And I think now that this was all the way back in 2018, Seb, but it feels like it's 100 years ago, literally. So welcome, Sebene. It's so good to have you here with us. And it's really generous of you to be giving us your presence and time today.
Oh, thank you both. So good to be with you and to see you. And thank you everyone for being here too.
I'm really excited. And one of the things that I was reflecting on is because when someone comes out with a book, especially a first book, there are these celebratory podcasts and events and things like that. And it can be easy for someone to think, oh, this person is just here because they wrote a book and this is about promoting the book. And one of the things I felt was so rich in the book is that there are many kind of learnings within learnings that are really important for us, especially right now at this point in our history. a lot of sounds happening around me, so if it gets difficult, I might put in my earplugs. Um, we have a little showing off going on outside. So before we dive in together, I just wanted to acknowledge that I am coming to you today as an uninvited settler on the unceded territory of the Neponsit Band of the Massachusetts Nation, and then previously way back early on in my life as an invited settler of the Seneca Nation in Salamanca, New York, who are also known as the Keepers of the Western Door. So I wanted to dive in, and first just to say, Seb, what a beautiful book. And I feel this is the kind of work that can be returned to over and over and over again. And I'll talk about that a little bit as we go throughout. When I think about sort of the three maybe most important aspects of humanity, they feel to be our sense of meaning and purpose and belonging. And I feel like a lot has been written about meaning and purpose, and maybe less has been addressed about the third, about belonging. And I'm wanting to know if you could share with us about your book's premise and what drove you to write it.
I say in the book, and I've been mentioning that I have been kind of living the truth of the feelings of this book my whole life. I only took about a couple of years to write it, but I feel like I was living it my entire life because I felt like I didn't belong. And there have been some books about belonging, but I find that they're not talked about as books about belonging, and they often only address one side of it. So there are sort of social analyses of belonging and community that is really about fitting in or not fitting in, and our sociological kind of experience of belonging. And then there's the spiritual books about belonging that maybe don't name belonging, but talk about our interconnection and the truth of our belonging to kind of a soulful idea of belonging. And this book, I really wanted to examine the two and look at the paradox of the truth of both of those, that there can be a social sense of belonging, and that's the truth of our reality as individuals, and that one is very fraught for many of us because of our ignorance or ignoring of the other side of belonging, which is the truth of our fundamental interconnection. And those two are paradoxical. So, we are interconnected. There's no separation. That's what all wisdom traditions teach us. Science has shown the truth of that in its own ways and metaphors, but there is difference. There is the feeling of separation, and that has wrought a lot of suffering, oppression, injustice. And how do we reconcile those two? And we're really in a reckoning of that in this moment in our country and our world, really.
Yeah, that's really profound. And when you talk about paradox, I feel like that's actually a tool of the book to actually use these apparent poles of paradox and help with integrating. And it feels like that's as sort of in general in humanity right now, we struggle a lot with paradox. Was that a conscious tool that you were bringing to bear on the book and the book Matter?
Yeah, a conscious tool, not because I'm so creative, but a conscious tool because it's the truth of our existence is paradox. And our very modern, as moderns, steeped in kind of Western, rational, intellectual configuring of reality, we don't like paradox. Like, we want things to make sense. We want equations to add up, and we want only what is seen and known by our senses to be the truth. But when we really lean into the paradox of mystery and the interconnection that cannot be understood just with the rational mind, paradox is all that we have, really. And to rest easy with that. In some ways, people are made uncomfortable by paradox because of the way we see things. But to me, paradox becomes like a place of ease and a place of rest. So we don't have to have it all figured out.
I love that. And I think within this paradox, and we're heading into in the US, I don't want to be too US centric today, but we're heading into the elections. in just less than 2 months. And so this idea that people that believe so differently than we do could belong to us and we could belong to them is I think really revolutionary. And in the book you talk about your own experience with this with Bush, and I'm wondering if you can share that. I thought that was a really deep and meaningful exercise and could be helpful to us now.
Yeah, so I talk about what seemed like simpler times now, but it was when George W. Bush was president and Katrina had just happened, and just a lot of anger and frustration. And for me, what I was noticing was really repetitive thinking. So it kind of felt in my body all the emotional just tightness and upset around this, what I felt was this great injustice, but I had still a lot of like angry thoughts. So I was working with those using the metta practice, loving kindness practice, but I wasn't doing a traditional metta practice. I wasn't, saying phrases of well-wishing or kindness towards myself and then, kind of circling out and making George Bush my difficult person. I was actually just focusing on him and imagining what it would be like to be him. So I was kind of using the metta practice as a way to step into someone else's reality or shoes, using kind of an imaginal practice. So I was imagining what it would be like to be George Bush from the time of his conception to the present day, that moment. And it was this funny little kind of practice that I created for myself. And for weeks, I did that every morning. And I would sort of piece together the pieces of his life, and as much as possible with my imagination, kind of imagine what his life was like. What would it be like to go to school in, a boarding school? And what would it be like to be raised in kind of a stiff family, to be the son of a president, and just to feel what it was like. And, consciously, of course, I knew that if I had George Bush's life, I would be like George Bush. But to have that visceral felt sense of that came as an insight for me that, oh, me thinking that I would be anything else but him if I had his life is a type of dominance. It's a type of arrogance. And it's a real misunderstanding of the nature of reality and causes and conditions, that if I had his karma, I would have his karma. I would be him. And so it really flipped something for me and just opened my heart in a way that I hadn't been able to with just a kind of conceptual understanding of he's only doing what he knows how to do.
Yeah, and really, really integrated through your body. So it wasn't just an intellectual exercise. And that sounds like something that we could all use more of right now as we're heading into things. It feels very polarized in the US, and even within smaller communities like the yoga community, I'm seeing a lot of online fighting and discussions about masks that just feel incredibly opposite and incredibly polarized. So I love that we have something else that we can practice and engage with.
And it takes a lot of practice. So this is, again, not something we can do just as an intellectual exercise, and it really needs to start with ourselves and see how, because I haven't been paying too much attention to the polarization in terms of the media, because that is very uh, upsetting to our sense of understanding the truth of experience. We're just sort of witnessing these battles. But what I notice is this tendency to want to be right.
Yeah.
Right. And that in itself is this sense of domination. Like, I want it to be right. And right after the George Bush story in the book, I tell the story of being on retreat and obsessively going over this breakup with an ex, and how he was my difficult person for years in my metta practice. And I was constantly kind of sending him well-being. And I really did wish, honestly, like I could feel it. I wished for his well-being. And I still had this sense that I was right, and going over it in my mind. And I asked the teacher, it was James Barris at the time, I told him what was happening. And I said, I just have this need to be right. And James just looked at me and said, "You are right." And that confirmation just allowed me to release all of the domination that was showing up. Like my insistence on needing to be right was just a dominating and oppressive patterning. And those domination patterns are how we got into this mess in the first place.
Yeah. Yeah.
And these polarized arguments really just mimic all of those oppressive patterns. They mimic the exact patterns that we say that we're trying to undo.
That, I was really taken with that because it isn't something that I've seen you manifest, particularly the need to be right. And it's something I have strongly grown up with myself. And so I thought, oh, okay, it is possible to work with this in a way that it maybe seasons over time or mellows a little bit.
Yeah, and I mean, it's still a struggle for me. I talk about that in the book that, I think I don't mention this, but when I used to live with my best friend Peter and I were roommates for years, and the joke in our apartment was that he was allowed to be right on Tuesdays. Because I would constantly get into these intellectual and spiritual debates. And that's a tendency I have to really watch for in myself. But it's a pattern that I'm very attuned to because I've watched it in myself. I can really see how it's playing out right now. And, these comment battles that people are getting into is that exact domination tendency.
And what's really compelling to me about that and how you write about this in the book is that that form of domination really diminishes our own belonging. And I don't think that was something I had connected in that way until you made that connection. I really, that's going to be a keeper for me in terms of really working and engaging with that. Because it can feel a lot to the person who's right, like, you know, the rightness sort of eclipses the awareness of not belonging, I think.
Yeah, something else I mention is a statement that I first heard from a Dharma teacher friend of mine, Dawa Tarshan Phillips, who said, you can take a stand without taking a side. And it's not that we give up all of our aspirations for change, and we can see clearly what needs to be shifted because we are moving towards growing this sense of non-harm. And sometimes changing that means stopping harm. So we sometimes need to take a position, we need to take a stand, but we don't do it by insisting that someone else has to be on the other side.
Yeah. Yeah. That's revolutionary for me. And I think in particular with any kind of polarized place that I'm in, I'm gonna be digesting that, I think, for a while. I feel like I remember hearing from you early on when we had our mentoring sessions and we were talking about the book process, that initially you were going to be, and I could be misremembering, but I thought you were starting out writing about anxiety. So that might be a real memory and it might not be. And we talked a lot about audience together because I was just beginning, or maybe I was in the middle of my book process or my proposal process, which was going iconically slow. And at some point, your topic and audience changed. And for anyone with us today that that considers themselves a creative, and I think that is a group that we all belong to, even if we think we don't. Can you tell us a little bit about the process of writing and what changed and how it developed and how you knew that you were talking to who you were talking to?
Oh, yeah, that's really interesting. I wasn't going to write about anxiety. I had two kind of ideas for a book when I first started working with an agent, and one was on cancer and my experience with cancer, and the other was on belonging. And maybe I was talking about just my general anxiety around writing, not writing about anxiety. But I realized that I didn't want to write only about cancer because it wasn't, it was such a challenging experience and I learned so much from it, but it wasn't something that I wanted to explore deeply. It didn't feel like a truth that I wanted to help people see into. It just felt like a particular experience I had that maybe others have too. But within that experience and within all experience is this truth of belonging, and how reckoning with that is a pathway to freedom. And in terms of like how I was writing to an audience, I really, I don't remember who told me this, if it was in a writing class, but just the idea of having a reader in mind. And one of the challenges of my book is I'm trying to really acknowledge our different experiences. And for me, being a Black woman, one of the primary ones is around race and how a white reader might read a book versus a person of color. And that's a huge generalization, because within each of those kind of very constructed categories, there's a wealth of experience. But there was a way in which I was writing to two people, and I chose two people in my life, one white and one a woman of color immigrant. And I kind of wrote to them. I wrote to those two people, which meant that sometimes I had to change my voice. And there are points in the book where I speak directly to the white reader, and acknowledge that a message for them might be different than for a person of color who's reading the book.
I found that to be really powerful in the voice. And that was one of the things I wanted to ask you about. I mean, I love the voice of this book because it sounds just like you. And before we went live, we were talking about how rare that is in a book. And for those of you that are going to read this book, please look at the bits in parentheses. Those are totally not to be missed, and incredibly, they're funny, they're sharp, they have like a biting wit, they're honest, they're challenging, they're warm, they're loving. And that was really cool to me, to see you sort of being yourself. And to that point, I felt like there is a compelling set of what I'm thinking of as these energetic bookends in the book. And at the end, I was thinking about the power of the writing prompts, that there are these really profound writing prompts that are rich and really evergreen, in the sense that I could do a writing prompt now and then go back to that same prompt in 6 months and be in a totally different place. My answers could change each time. And then on the cover, and you could miss this if you don't actually read below the title, because I realized, oh my gosh, my eye is so trained to read the title and the subtitle. And I saw something here right on the cover that I've never seen before. You know what I'm referring to. You've written under the subtitle, Nerdy Black Immigrant Tomboy Buddhist Weirdo. That's so you. And can you tell us about the journey of putting that on the cover and what that means?
You know, I have to give credit to my editor, Sydney Rogers at Harper One, because she added that to my byline, my author byline. And it came from something, I don't think it's in the book anymore, but a line somewhere I had written at some point that kind of outlined all of those elements of my being. And it felt perfect, you know, it really felt like it highlighted kind of aspects that I'm trying to bring out in the book, that our differences don't negate our belonging to each other. And that paradox of not being separate but not being the same is such a key understanding of the book. And in terms of, I really feel like that author byline reflects the voice of the book. And the voice actually, and we were in conversation a lot during my proposal writing and your proposal writing as well. And I found my voice as I was writing the proposal. And that was really liberating, to realize that I could write a proposal in the same voice that I wanted to write the book, even though I didn't even know that I wanted to do that. I didn't know that's the voice I wanted to use. I think, you know, especially with an idea of a book and a first book, we can have some conception or perception of how it should be, that it should model some kind of mainstream, usually masculine idea of what writing is, and what an authorial voice is. And it was really empowering to speak with the voice of authority, of knowing that I'm speaking the truth, like a deep spiritual and sacred truth, but I can do it with, you know, my quirkiness and my weirdoness and my wit.
Yeah, and it's not well-behaved writing. And I mean that in the best possible way. I'm thinking about like the Dharma culture that I've not been in for very long, but long enough to know that it's like, no, you can't swear in parentheses, or you don't, and I think the message within that, I really read every word, and I found myself really buoyed by the parts in parentheses, especially, and the parts that were, yeah, that were really challenging, because I think that really feels like you're speaking directly to the person reading.
Mm.
And I love that. And that sort of makes me think a lot about one of the most profound insights that you offered to me, Seb, during our mentoring, was about this concept of the view from the margins and the benefits of being on the margins versus being at the center. And it feels to me like your subtitle is like saying, here are all the circles on the margin that I can see from, and some might be closer to center, some might be further away. But can you share your thoughts on that with us? I think it would be really beneficial to everyone.
Yeah, sure. So I use this metaphor of margin and center, which we have gotten used to kind of in modern thought, that we talk about marginalized people. So we're speaking as if people are on the outsides of some center. So I use an image of concentric circles, and depending on our social location and social position, we may be closer to the center or farther out. And you can even look at a city to sort of imagine what that's like New York City, Manhattan being kind of the center of wealth and dominance, and especially in terms of even real estate prices. The more affluent, wealthy, powerful people live in the center, and the farther you go out to the margins, you have people of color, immigrants, and less access to the center. And so we can see society in the same way, that people have access to resources and certain privilege in the center and have less and less access on the margins. But if we look at that image, people who are in the center can only see the center, and people on the margins have great perspective. They're often traveling into the center of the city and out, and see so much along the way. So we often think of a marginalized position as being inferior or somehow disadvantaged, but there's a lot of advantage and perspective that's gained from the margins that can't happen from the center.
Yeah. It is such a liberatory concept, and one that I think I keep coming back to, and the many ways in which I have thought that I need to be closer and closer to center. And I remember you saying, well, I remember there was some kind of incident that happened with a major organization slash mentor. And you were saying, well, why do you want that person to continue like being your place or your like, what is it that compels you? And the only answer that I could come up with is that there's this magnetic social pressure, but there was nothing intrinsic to that connection that made me feel any sense of belonging or even desire to continue. And that was really surprising to me.
Mm-hmm.
I had never thought to question in that way what my allegiance was, and whether it was organically true to me or being sort of socially determined.
Yeah, well, so often we can be led to believe that access and resources are more important than wisdom and understanding, which, of course, the Dharma teaches the exact opposite, that wisdom and understanding are the key to our liberation and freedom. And so, of course, resources are important, and the more marginalized communities can really be harmed by lack of access to healthcare or healthy food or different resources. But that's not liberating in and of itself, right? To be at the center.
Yeah.
And then there's that really mind fuck of a flip that happens by saying that you have more objectivity by being at the center, right? Marginalized people are caught in identity politics and their positionality, and so it's the exact opposite of the truth. And there's more kind of studied observance of this, like standpoint theory, which I mentioned in the book, kind of a sociological understanding of how that manipulation happens, that people are made to feel like they have less perspective from the margins, when in fact that they have more perspective and objectivity from the margins than from the center.
That feels like it connects in with you talked a lot about sort of indigenous ways of knowing and knowing through the body. And it feels to me like at the center, there's this idea that only certain types of knowledge have value. And I love what you did with that in the book.
Yeah, that's also studied by many more than me. This idea of epistemicide, or the killing of other ways of knowing. That often we look at the genocide of peoples and maybe of cultures as kind of a fact, but not as, we don't go deeply into how different ways of knowing are discredited. So we may lose cultural facts, but we've also lost cultural methods and deeply indigenous ways of knowing that don't fit into kind of the rational scientific materialist model. So if we even look at mindfulness or the Buddha Dharma and the way that it's taught in the West, there's a lot of attention to proving its efficacy through experiments and studies, which is wonderful. And there's some of it that may not be understood by our limited tools that are based in our ordinary senses and what can be measured. And that there's a lot of ways of knowing that come from other cultures that are rooted in mystery, that are rooted in the body and an embodied way of knowing, that are rooted in unseen things, unseen beings and forces. And just because it can't be measured by science, it doesn't mean that it's not true or right.
I love that. And it feels to me like, this brought together a few concepts for me. I'll try to articulate them. But for me, science is fascinating. And I don't think I understood until sort of seeing this, maybe until recently, that my relationship with science is a playful one. Like it's a starting. And in your book, you have this, et cetera. And I think it's a way of continuing to point to how important embodied awareness and embodied knowledge is. I'm wondering, I'm getting a little unstable connection. There we go.
Yeah, I lost you for a moment. You were saying you have a playful relationship to science.
Yeah, but I don't think I knew that until really recently. And in your book, when you mention studies, it's not with this deferential, like, in 2007 there was a double-blind study, and this means X and Y. It's really as a point, as a touchstone, and the value is, I think, in its relationship to indigenous and embodied knowledge. And I found that to be really, really nourishing.
Yeah, I hope, and I don't know if this is a conscious intention or just my way of understanding things, but I just treated science as just any other way of knowing things, right? And for people to test it out for themselves. Ultimately, most of the book is an invitation for people to feel belonging through practice, really.
I love that. And I'm wondering if this might be a good time. We were going to do one of your favorite practices that you were going to lead us in and kind of bring it back into the body. Does now feel like it would be a good time for that?
Yeah, sure. So I
Let's do it.
wanted to share, and this kind of speaks to what we were talking about. I wanted to share a practice that is become really important for me in my daily practice, formally, but also in how to bring mindfulness into my everyday life, because we're not practicing to become good meditators. We're practicing to really be able to bring this capacity for awareness and really for freedom and joy into any moment. So there's a formal practice of mindfulness of the four elements of earth, fire, water, and air. And it's interesting that this is a classical practice. It's right in there in the Satipatthana Sutta, which is the sutta where modern mindfulness gets all of its teachings from. So it's there with mindfulness of breath and mindfulness of the body, but it's not taught very much. And I think that it has to do with exactly this way that these indigenous ways of knowing um, are not so comfortable for moderns. And, you know, the elements are referred to in the traditions of every continent. So ancient Egypt and ancient Greece and Chinese medicine and Ayurveda and the indigenous traditions of the Americas and Africa and Australia, that the metaphor of the four elements is a really helpful one for connecting to our bodies and also to connect us to everything else in nature, because the elements basically become metaphors for our material reality. And in being with them, we can dissolve the boundary between our bodies and what's around us. So it's a really powerful practice. So I want to share that with you all today, and just invite you to take a posture that feels settled for you. So, you know, really feeling your seat, feeling the chair underneath you, or if you're lying down or sitting back, just really feeling that restful weight of your body right now. You might want to take a couple of deep breaths in and out as you witness the room around you, removing your attention away from the screen and really reorienting to where you are in this moment. And as you settle into the meditation, you can allow your eyes to close if that feels comfortable and right for you. You can also just leave them open, gazing softly away from the screen. And just begin by noticing your solidity, your weight here. So you might feel contact with the floor underneath you, under your feet or seat, or feel the solidity of a chair as you feel this earth element in you in contact with the earth underneath you, earth on earth. Really sensing the heaviness, the stability, the solidity of the earth element. Feeling the density of the bones, of the flesh, of fat, of muscle, all that is solid, all that is dense is the earth element in you. And this earth element is in relationship to all the earth around you, the earth element of rocks and mountains, trees and animals, of the earth herself. Sensing how this element can help you feel grounded and rooted like a tree. Knowing you are earth, as we move our attention to the second element of fire. which can be felt by noticing temperature in the body. Fire is heat and power, warmth, vibration. Perhaps you can feel warmth or temperature change in the belly or the chest, in the armpits or the groin. Wherever there is this feeling of warmth is the fire element in you. Knowing the warmth of the fire element in you is epitomized externally by the sun. We cannot live without this fire element, the warmth of our living bodies, of this living planet. Knowing that this energy, this vibration and power is the fire element in you and around you. As we move to the third element of water, which is all that is smooth and flowing and fluid in the body, that most of our body is water. Perhaps sensing this in the saliva in your mouth or the moistness of your eyes. Perhaps there's moisture on the body, or you can sense the blood and fluid coursing all throughout your whole system. Sensing that you are also this water element that is flowing and fluid, and that this is in balance to all the water of this planet, the lakes and oceans and rivers, the icebergs, the snow, the rain, the clouds, the dew, that our planet is mostly water too, that water is life. Knowing that you can feel this fluid and flowing nature of the water element in you and around you in any moment. As we come to this final element of air, what is movable and changeable, light and ephemeral, air moving in and out of the body, breath by breath, into the lungs, and nourishing every single cell in your body. connecting to the power of this lightness and changeability, nourishing us moment to moment. Knowing that each breath is connecting us to all that is around us, air enveloping this planet, breathed in and out by breathing beings, connecting us to the plants, to the oceans, to the sky, to each other. Resting in the silence of this awareness of the breathing, of the air element. As we end this meditation, knowing that we can connect to earth, fire, water, and air in any moment, knowing that these elements are us and everything. So you open your eyes, come back to the space, to the screen.
Feels like such a just, yes, cellular renewal, kind of really nourishing, embodied place. And I love doing that in the middle of our discussion, because then I'm less likely to want to get in every single question that I wanted to ask you. I feel like this might be a nice ground from which to talk about some of the sort of social issues that you bring up in relation to belonging. And one of the elements you mentioned is that we belong. And you talked in a beautiful way, kind of weaving science and sort of embodied knowing, is that we belong to our ancestors and to unseen beings. And I love the way your book talks about that. And I remember that it is something that doesn't often come easily to people, this idea that what we can't see or what we think is in another place in time, we don't belong to. And I'm wondering if you can expound on that a little bit. I remember in the retreat that I sat with you, that was also a point where people were struggling to feel like, well, what does that mean? You know, how do I do that? Why would I want to do that?
Yeah, again, ways of knowing that have been dismissed, especially in modern culture, depending how acculturated we've been to kind of Western dominant ways of thinking, is something that's very accepted in many other cultures. This idea that our ancestors are here with us, that that there are unseen forces or unseen beings that we can relate to or connect to. And it doesn't have to be a belief that we take on. And this is where modern science can help those of us who are more skeptical or can't wrap our minds around that mystery, is that there's so much we don't know. There are things that we have objectively or maybe mathematically known for over a century. You know, Einstein himself said that time is an illusion, and you know that space and time and matter are relative to each other. And modern science is showing us, or contemporary science is showing us, a lot of the mysteries of how matter is more energy than it is solid. It's more space than it is substance. So there's so much we don't understand and don't know, not to mention the theories about other dimensions and all of the mysteries of how we relate to each other and what's actually happening when even atoms are in relationship to each other. So I really like to think of these ancient ways of knowing as they're just different metaphors, you know, different metaphors for what is ultimately mystery. So science has equations and kind of physics to use as a metaphor, and spirituality has the idea of unseen beings and communication with our ancestors as a metaphor. But even scientifically, we know, for example, about epigenetic information. We know that more than just our physical genes are handed down, but actually memories and patterned ways of being and behaving are also handed down. So even on a physical fundamental level, we know that our ancestors are literally within us. Like their emotional patterns exist within us. So they're here, even if you don't think they're here in some other dimension that we can't see, they're here in the sense that they're inside us. And so to really start to untangle that, each of us for ourselves, and know that our patterns are more than just, our fault from this lifetime, but really a wealth of causes and conditions and experiences that led us to being the way we are right now.
I remember reading about how we share our gut microbiome back several generations, and that even what we
Wow.
eat shares its microbiome with us. So I think even more this idea that we're even what we consume and digest and don't digest is kind of literally what we don't digest is passed along.
That's amazing. I love that. You know, not to mention that that means there's millions of beings just within each of us.
We
Right?
contain multitudes.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that for me is a place where I think belonging can almost feel easier to access, um, in terms of my relationship with unseen beings than it is like the people that seem to be in the here and now. Yeah, and I love the way you kind of address and talk about that in the book in this very accessible way, especially now during a time when there's so much of social isolation, um, and how much, in some ways, it's great to have social media to connect, and in other ways, it can even sort of magnify the pressures of social media that we already feel. I notice I've been struggling with not wanting to post, um, and that makes me remember that, you know, one of the really meaningful conversations we had that I actually didn't do anything about yet is that you were encouraging me to post all of myself, like to the parts that I don't normally show. And I was thinking like, oh, that's hard, and yeah, I'll get to that. And then time went by, and then I was thinking about it as a sort of a form of self affirmation. And I don't think it was till reading you talking about that in the book that I realized that that in itself could be an exercise in belonging for me, like bringing in more of myself and not the parts that here in the yoga circle, I'm only allowed to talk about X and Y. Or as a healer, I can talk about Z, but not X and Y. So I think that's something I'm revisiting now. Get ready.
That's great. And it's so beautiful, right? Because it's such a great example for others. You know, social media is just such a weird space, and it's what we contend with as part of our reality and part of how we really share teachings and share resources in this moment. And so how do we do that in a way that actually uplifts the truth of all of this? And so speaking authentically and impactfully with purpose becomes even more important, right?
And now I feel like if you brought in your dance, I can bring in these other things. So if anyone doesn't follow Sub on social media, you have to see. It's just a wonderful way of unself-consciously welcoming in something that was really important to you that normally we would be really, and maybe we're still conscious that there's a set of eyes watching what we're doing. There's a gaze, and sort of flipping off the gaze in your own way.
Yeah, it's still constructed, of course, and there's still there's no way to kind of be in the truth of my experience unless someone is in my body. But as much as possible, trying to share what will be liberatory rather than posturing or teaching from on high. And so those dance videos I shared is really to acknowledge the truth of the lack of freedom in our bodies. How often, and I talk about this in the book, that we are afraid to dance in public because we're afraid that we'll look bad or awkward or look like we don't know what we're doing, and we might not know what we're doing. And I very bravely posted the video with my dance teacher, who is amazing. And so I do not look like her. And side by side, we're dancing to the same songs in our Zoom screens. And yeah, I hope that it's liberating for others as much as it is for me.
And I mean, I suppose someone who knows a lot about dance could say you don't look like her in terms of the exactitude of the movements, but your joy looks like her joy.
Yeah, yeah.
I think in that way. And that reminds me that one of the things I wanted to ask you about is you talked in the book, and this is something you actually shared with me a couple years ago that really changed a lot, is Audre Lorde's writings on the erotic and the erotic as liberatory. Can you say a little bit about that? I think we do have men on this call, but it's predominantly women in yoga, and I feel like the yoga world has really so constricted the erotic among many other things, and I think there's a lot of history and reasons behind that, and one of those is cultural appropriation. But could you what feels important to you to share
It's
about?
important. So that's an essay by Audre Lorde in her book Sister Outsider, and it's such a powerful piece. I really recommend people go Google it. There's PDFs online that you can find. The uses of the erotic as power, it's called. And one of the most powerful aspects of that essay to me is her use of the word erotic to describe really what I think mindfulness is describing, our capacity. We called it mindfulness, but actually the word is sati, and it means this kind of embodied awareness of our experience that we can only know through our senses. And she is describing a really sensory, a sense-based awareness of our life. And so we often think of the erotic as sexual, and it's not sexual. She's not eliminating that, but she's not limiting it to that. She's saying that an erotic experience of our life is one in which we are fully aware of all of our sensory experience. And that's where the liberation is to be really connected to our senses so that we know what's happening moment to moment through all six senses, including the mind.
What's really powerful about that is I feel like the yoga world can seem to have that because it's focused on movement and stretching and bodies, but sometimes it has that in a very sort of white dominant culture way. And then when I think about it took me a long time to sort of get into the world of mindfulness because that seemed very cerebral. So I love this idea that there is something now I don't want to say in the center, but there's something the connective tissue between them is this juicy, erotic kind of sensual or sense-based experience of the world.
I love
And
that.
that's it's something I think that's socialized out of us a lot.
Yes, definitely.
What else did I have? I wanted to talk about, so that sort of leads us into this idea of spiritual bypassing and cultural spiritual bypassing, which is something you teach on really beautifully. And that's something we've seen in the yoga and mindfulness worlds a lot. And this idea of appropriation, and you could talk about dismissal, exchange, appreciation, but what I was really interested in is the way you connected this to belonging. And I think this is something that in the yoga world has been struggling with, both in terms of the way yoga was appropriated and in terms of the way sort of dominant Western culture's presentation of yoga has been dominating and restrictive and leaves people out and harms and does harm. And I love that this is part of the conversation in the book, and you speak really directly and freely, like, I'm talking to you white people over here, and this over here, you're not being centered. And I think it, in just a beautiful way. How did you connect this with belonging? Because right now that feels really like who belongs and who doesn't.
Yeah, I think that it's hard to talk about this without. I don't get a lot into patriarchy in this book, partly because I want to write another book on patriarchy, but um, there's so many patterns, and I talk about the nuns in the Buddhist tradition, and just our complete acceptance in so many circles of the fact that women are treated as second-class citizens in these communities, these spiritual communities. But there is those dominating worldviews of men over women and white people over people of color that is just so inherent in the way that these teachings are brought forward, that it takes, and we do this in the course that you've been on, in the retreats that we explore this. There's an untangling that we have to do to just even start to see that clearly. Because we just walk into the room and accept that this is the way the teachings are, and that because they've come from these other cultures, that this is the way that we need to accept them, when in fact we're not even really examining, well, where did these teachings originate, and what cultures were they coming out of, and what worldviews did those cultures have, and how are they being communicated to us, how are they being handed down, and then how are they being filtered through white teachers, often white male teachers, and being then recommunicated in a particular way. Like, there's a lot to untangle. Sometimes I have this phrase that I use, the unbearable complexity of belonging or freedom, that we can't just sort of accept the teachings and then say that that's the truth. Like, we actually have to look at how things are being communicated, and that really starts to get into cultural appropriation, cultural dismissal, the way things can be taken kind of willy-nilly and insist that that's the way it is. So as an example, just sort of saying that devotional practices are cultural baggage, and that there's sort of a pure experience of mindfulness that's the most important or appropriate. So it's very complex, is what I'm trying to say, and we can use a lot of the tools of kind of our social science way of understanding things now, and our cultural way of understanding that has been the work of Black feminists and queer theorists and a lot of people who can kind of lend us perspectives that help us understand this.
And I feel like we are moving maybe out of the moment where in yoga, this idea that politics is over there and yoga is over here is starting to fall by the wayside. And I think that's really important. And something else that I think you connected really beautifully in the book is this idea of dominance and superiority as a sort of, I think, if I'm getting this right, a block to belonging. And it makes me think a lot about sort of white superiority and what Resmaa Menakem calls white body supremacy as really a block to belonging. And therefore not really actively aware of that and deconstructing that internally, I think that interferes, even if you sense that you're at the center, it's going to interfere with actual sort of true nourishing belonging.
Right, because any of us who have done even a little amount of spiritual practice and work on ourselves know that there's a lot of unconscious patterning. And so this patterning around dominance or superiority or even just outright oppression are unconscious patterns. Of course, they're conscious supremacist patterns, but a lot of the patterns that keep the systems going are completely embedded in our unconscious habits and ways of thinking and being and speaking. And so to start looking at that takes our practice and takes time.
And I think, and is still like really important. And I think that, as I was maybe saying before, like the idea of superiority as a block to belonging, as sort of the opposite of belonging, and maybe even a defense to deal with the senses of not belonging, like all of the above. And that feels like an illness, like a sort of internal illness.
Yeah, it's definitely, you know, a break in our true capacity for feeling freedom. You know, we all have that capacity for feeling freedom and the truth of our interconnection. And that doesn't erase the differences, but it doesn't turn the differences into domination and oppression. And the systems that we live in kind of create that illness, that sort of creating this delusion that we're separate and that means that we have to compete and create hierarchies.
And we play into that. So I know we're coming to a close, and one of the things that I really wanted to talk to you about sort of toward the end is this idea of being an empath. And for some reason, I was really surprised to see that in the book you talked about sort of giving so much energy to other people and how that was like a pattern. And maybe sort of me coming to know you relatively in the last several years and seeing you as somebody who's actually really incredibly boundaried. And I work a lot as an empath and with empaths, and I thought that was a really important piece. And if you could comment just a little bit on the relationship between being an empath and belonging, and maybe even sort of like grounding. And no, you have some no work happening in the book, and how belonging to ourselves, it feels like, is really important, and how hard that is. That is so, I know that if someone I love is having difficulty, or maybe even like somebody I don't know very well on the internet, I can be sort of incubating that in my own self long after it's even an issue for them. It's sort of lingering in my body. And I remember sort of talking after one of your retreats where you seemed very compassionate and present, but that you weren't holding on to like all the stuff that was going on with people on retreat. And that to me was really miraculous. And I think our empaths would love hearing about that.
Yeah, you know, I think this is part of the way I see it is around conditioning. So I don't think I call myself an empath in the book because I don't use that language because I don't want to identify with that identity really. Because it's a pattern and it's conditioning. It's, of course, all of us have different talents and capacities, and some people are more attuned to others, but we all have the capacity to attune to others. I think empaths are created more than created in the sense that certain people are gendered into it, certain people because of birth order or family dynamics are cultivated to hold that. And that could serve a purpose actually as in family dynamics. Sometimes someone needs to be the empathic one to help the dynamics of the family, but to over-identify with that capacity, which is something that I did because it became sort of, and I never called myself an empath, I think because I didn't know the language. I probably totally would have called myself an empath if I had known it back then. It becomes a way to feel good about oneself, right? It kind of plays into a kind of inverted dominance pattern where I become indispensable and special and important. And I had to learn the really hard way through 3 diagnoses of breast cancer, that I couldn't sort of constantly be giving from this heart space without doing myself harm, and that this was in some way almost pathological in me. And I remember a medical intuitive I heard speaking about breast cancer once. She said she intuits breast cancer is like an over-nurturance gland.
Yeah.
And so for me, it was really important for my life, really for my existence, to have to start to draw boundaries and connect to what my friend Maria calls inner knowing, Noing, like really being clear about when I am losing that sense of myself and tipping over into an identification with helping others rather than really feeling resourced enough to offer what I can in that moment.
I love that. I love that. And I think the belonging that comes from being an empath is not really belonging in the same way. It's a form of social currency.
Yes.
So I like the idea of deconditioning that through mindfulness and also through sort of getting really good at the inner knowing.
Mm-hmm. And
Yeah.
really, as social currency, becoming a tool of systems, right? Like the systems can only function if we have a lot of women constantly caregiving for
Oh,
people who
wow.
are completely depleted by systems that are overtaxing them.
Even families.
Right. Those are systems.
Yeah, that's amazing. That is, yeah, I'm going to be reflecting and chewing on that for a long time. Um, I think that we can work toward closure. I think one of the things I wanted to just appreciate about the book is that you have this incredible skill as a teacher, Seb. It's you impart really valuable knowledge and content, but there's also an essence, a kind of connective tissue between ideas that when I go back and reflect, I'm always finding more. And I'm asking in part because it feels like I don't know if this is something that you've practiced or it's an innate and natural skill. And I think it feels like in the context of dominant culture and white dominant culture, we have this sort of consumptive knowledge framework in which we're supposed to inhale these bits of information and podcasts and webcasts like this or webinars, and then we want to spit out anything that might taste medicinal or bitter or that we don't understand. And then what we did retain, just kind of express and apply it right away. And to me, your teachings and this book is like an heirloom seed, and kind of layered and nourishing and kind of a call to revisiting on a really deep level.
Oh,
And not
that's
to
beautiful.
it has always felt that way to me. So if I go back on something that you've said to me that stands out, there's always another, I get, oh, there's also this aspect to it, and it's this. And I think that your writing and the gifts in the book really call us to, or invite us to digest slowly and revisit and masticate and harvest and engage with the insights. And so I want to encourage everybody to approach it in that way. It's not just a book where you take a few notes and then end. So thank you for the gift of the book and the gift of your time. It's been such a joy to have you.
Oh, thank you, Bo. It's so great to see you. And I have to say, I cannot wait for your book, No Pressure.
Please, no pressure. It could be a long time. I mean, this is like becoming the 10-year project. But it might actually, I feel, be easier in the writing than it was in everything leading up to that.
I know it's going to be brilliant.
Thanks in part to you. And with your permission, instead of just closing, I wanted to try something that we sometimes do or have done, I think, since the pandemic started, where we have a sort of technology version of metta, or techmet, which always makes me think of the goddess Sekhmet, who's like a warrior goddess and a healer and a solar goddess. And so those of you that are still with us, if many of you know this drill, but if you could think of a word or a phrase that you want to offer to yourself, to everyone on the call, and mostly to Seb, you can enter it in the chat. And I think for me, the felt sense that I have to offer, I'll go first. So here in Boston or the Massachusetts territory, and just big gratitude and love for you. Thank you, Seb, thank you for you.
Thank you. Thank you.
And then we can go, do you want to read some of these together in the chat?
Oh, beautiful. Nourished and seen, authentic and generous.
Oh, they're going fast.
Insight and kindness, light and peace, embodied tranquility. I love that. Ancestral knowledge. Yes. Enlightened and validation, seen, supported, intriguing, softness, beautiful. So many of my favorite words. Stop overtaxing oneself. Yes. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Thank you all. Thank you for being here and taking time out. I know we're also zoomed out, so I really appreciate that you made time to be here.
We are zoomed out. And and we have one location, Vancouver Island.
Oh,
Everyone else is
beautiful.
just overflowing so much that we're not saying where we are.
Oh, thank you all. Thank
yay.
you.
Hi, Tanya.
Oh, wow.
Oh, now we
From
have
all over. Yeah.
we do. And I know we had some people from London earlier, Southern California. Hi, Barbara. Mohegan Land and upstate New York.
Yeah. Beautiful.
Validated.
Yeah.
Still listening from London. Hi.
Oh, wow.
It's getting late there.
Thunder Bay. Amazing.
Yeah, Thunder Bay, Ontario. So some of these will continue to come in and I'll send you the chat sub. And so for all of you here that want to maybe watch again and get those heirloom seeds of wisdom all on the page, boforbes.com/7a, we'll put the replay link up there. And I can also link to Audre Lorde's piece on the erotic. Yeah, I can upload it there. You're getting lots of hearts. So thank you, Seb, so much.
Thank you, Bo. So great to be with you. Thank you, everyone.
Yes, see you soon.
I hope so.
Bye.
Bye, everyone.